Okay, so today's lesson, the goal is for you to rewrite quadratic functions in vertex form using the completing the square method. Give me 1 second. Here is the first problem. Please write down y equals x squared plus 10x plus 8. We're going to rewrite this in vertex form using the completing the square method. Our first step is to take the constant and move it to the opposite side. So when I move a positive 8 to the opposite side, it just switches signs. Then I'm going to take, this is the A term, the B term, and I want to figure out the C term. You're going to take this term, the B term, forget about the x, and you're always going to divide it by 2. 10 divided by 2 in this case is 5. And then I'm going to square it. By the way, I would like you to put some type of a bubble around here. A bubble, and I want you to point to the plus sign up above. Because we're going to come back to that. And hopefully that will help remind you about an upcoming step. So 5 squared is 25. In this position, I put a 25. Notice that we have an equation, and we have to keep it balanced for the equation to work. I just added 25 to the right, so I must also add it to the left to keep the equation balanced. Now on the left, I combine like terms, and I have y plus 17, different sign subtract, keep the sign of the larger number. And on the right-hand side, I get to rewrite this. X plus 5 plus 5, quantity squared. This is another way to write this trinomial. Now I move 17 back to the opposite side by subtracting. And this is the vertex form. This is standard form. 3 things today. One is write it in vertex form. The second is to identify the vertex. The vertex for this problem is -5, -17. And also identify the y-intercept. The y-intercept, looking at the original formula in standard form, would be 0, 8. Okay, let's go on to the next problem. Sure. Anybody else need more time? I'll give you any more time. Anybody else need more time? Okay, here's your next problem. Y equals 3x squared plus 12x minus 14. Again, we have 3 objectives. Write it in vertex form, identify the vertex, and the y-intercept. So the first step is to move this -14 to the opposite side. When it moves across the equal sign, it changes signs. So y plus 14. What differs about this problem in comparison to the first problem is we had a leading coefficient of 1 in the first problem. Now the leading coefficient is 3. In order for us to do completing the square, we need to factor out this 3. If this is ever a number different than 3, we need to factor out. So put a 3 here with parentheses. Now how do we factor it out? We start with the top. 3 divided by 3 is a 1. Bring down the x squared. Positive 12 divided by 3 is a positive 4. Bring down the x. And now I'm only focused on this portion of the problem. So just like in the last problem, we look at the b term. Remember, a, b, and c. We look at the b term. And we take the b and we divide it by 2. Notice that it is the number 2, and notice also that this number, this sign in front of the b was positive. 2 squared is 4, so as I add 4 back here, here is the tricky part, and this is the number 1 reason why students get this wrong. Like I added 25 to both sides to keep this balanced, I did not actually just add 4 to the side, I added 12, because there's a number out front. 3 times 4 is 12, so plus 12 to the opposite side. Going to combine like terms. Y plus 26 equals 3. And now in parentheses, it's x. Again, this sign is a positive. So x plus 2. Bring 26 to the opposite side. It was positive. When it moves over, it becomes negative. This is the vertex form of this equation in standard form. What is the vertex? The vertex is -2, -26. What is the y-intercept? The y-intercept is 0, -14. Third problem. Okay, our third problem is y equals, let me flip this around to give us more space. Y equals 8x squared plus 24x plus 13. First step is move the constant to the other side. So when the 13 moves over, it becomes -13. Now, because the leading coefficient is not a 1, you have to factor out this exact number. How do you factor it out? You start up above with the previous step. 8 divided by 8 is a 1, bring down the x squared. 24 divided by 8 is a 3, bring down the x. Bless you. Okay, now this is only where it gets a little trickier. Now we're going to work with some fractions. So I take out this b form here, and I take 3 and I divide it by 2, and then I'm going to square it. And I'm going to put a little bubble around that because I'm going to come back to that number and notice that it is positive. Now what is 3/2 squared? Well, 3 squared is 9, and 2 squared is 4. So in this position I go plus 9/4. Now in reality, I did not just add 9/4 to this side. I need to take 8 times that number. So take 9/4 in parentheses, take it times 8, and in reality, I just added 18 to the right. So I must add 18 to the left. Inside parentheses, it is x plus 3/2. I'll move 5 to the opposite side. When it moves across the equal sign, it does change signs. This is the vertex form of this equation. The vertex is -3/2 and -5, and the y-intercept is 0, 13. Red cup, green cup right now based on your understanding. Red cup, green cup. Okay. Here's your next problem. Y equals x squared minus 6x plus 10. First step is to move 10 to the opposite side. When it moves over, it becomes -10. Now the nice thing about this problem is that there's no number in front of the x squared, so I don't have to factor out a number. Remember, we only have to factor out something if this is different than 1. So I get to take the b, which is -6, and I get to divide it by 2. -6 divided by 2 is -3, and then I'm going to square it, but I do want us to remember this. When we put this in later, notice it's going to be a -3. -3 squared, -3 times -3 is a 9. I just added 9 to the right. I need to keep it balanced, so I add 9 to the left. Combine like terms, y subtract 1. In parentheses, it's x subtract 3 quantity squared. Then I move this negative 1 back over to the right. When it moves over, it does change signs to become a positive 1. Vertex is 3, 1. Y-intercept is 0, 10. Totally fine if you're a red cup. That's what I just need to see, like the percentage of kids we have that are red, green. Red cup, green cup right now. Red cup, green cup. Okay. Here we go. Now I'm going to slow this problem down. So you're writing down y equals negative 4x squared plus 32x minus 11. And just so I know, because the problem after this will include decimals, so I want to make sure that we're feeling more confident, we're just going to do a simple high hand raise and hand back down. If you're confused, that after every step I'll look up, okay? And then I'll stop and I'll explain. I won't call your name. So my first step is to move this to the opposite side, the constant. When it moves over, it switches signs. Again, you would raise your hand high and then put it back down if you're confused after that step, and I'll explain. Okay, now because the leading coefficient is anything different than 1, I need to factor out this number. How do you do that? You write down the number, parentheses follow it, and then to figure out what goes inside, we're going to start off with the step up above. Negative 4 divided by negative 4 is a 1, bring down the x squared. Positive 32 divided by negative 4 is negative 8, bring down the x. I'm only focused on this portion of the problem. This is my A, my B, and my C. So I'm looking at the B. I start with negative 8, and I divide it by 2. Negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4, and then I'm going to square it. Just remember, we're going to come back to this number. It's negative because the 8 was negative. Negative 4 squared is a positive 16. This will always be a positive number. We did not just add 16 to the right. In fact, we added a negative 64 because negative 4 times 16 is negative 4. 16 times negative 4 is negative 64. So on this side, I need to also add a negative 64, which is the same as subtracting 64. When I combine like terms, positive 11 and negative 64 is a negative 53. Oops, excuse me. Is a negative 53. And now what goes on the inside? X subtract 4. I bring the 53 back over to the opposite side. And the vertex is positive 4, positive 53. And the y-intercept is 0, negative 11. Does anyone have questions? Thank you. How did I get this number? Did you understand where I took this value, which is negative 8? I always take the b and I divide it by 2. So 8 divided by 2 is a 4, and it's a negative because the number, the side of the b is a negative. Does that help? Okay, go ahead.
Why did the number go in?
This is another way to write this exact same thing. It's another form of it. Just like you recognize now, hopefully, that x squared minus 25 is x plus 5 and x minus 5, right? This is another form of writing this. Good questions. Any other good questions? Okay, let's go on to a harder one. Let's challenge you. So it is y equals 1.2x squared plus 3.6x minus 2. What's the first step in all these problems? Move this to the opposite side. When it moves over, it becomes? So y plus 2 equals 1.2x squared plus 3.6x plus some quantity. Okay, now because this number is just not a single one, I have to factor it out. Feel free to use a calculator. Now how do we do this? We go top to the bottom. 1.2 divided by 1.2 is 1. Bring down the x squared. What is 3.6 divided by 1.2? Bring down the x. I'm only concerned with this portion right now. So I take this 3, which is your b term, and you always divide it by 2. Whether you write it as a fraction or an equivalent decimal, it makes no difference. Okay, I want to make sure that I remember this. Also note that it is positive in front. So 3 halves squared. So 3 squared is 9. 2 squared is 4. Again, whether we use decimals or fractions, it doesn't matter. Now, I didn't just add 9 halves this side. Can you guys please take 9 halves in parentheses times 1.2? Do you agree with 2.7? So I just added 2.7 to this side. I must add 2.7 to the left to keep the equation balanced. 2 plus 2.7 is 4.7. What goes inside? X plus 3 halves. Could you write it as a decimal? Sure you could. Now I move the 4.7 back to the opposite side. When you move it over, it becomes negative. There's your factor form. Vertex is negative 3 halves. You could write it as a decimal. And negative 4.7. Normally you see them both as decimals and then also both as fractions, but that means they're equivalent values. And then we have a y-intercept of 0, negative 2.